buried in peat, that was built in the winter of 3807 BCE. We know the year because the timbers preserved their growth rings, and those rings can be matched against a master record of tree growth going back thousands of years. Somebody felled those trees in the autumn and laid that track before the following spring, nearly 6,000 years ago, and we can name the season. It was built to cross a swamp, it was about a mile long, and it was made of planks pegged onto crossed poles driven into the mud. That is roughly the oldest engineered path we have solid evidence for. But it sits at the middle of the story rather than the beginning because the first roads were not built at all. They were worn. Let's dig into this properly because the question hides a distinction that matters enormously. A road, in the sense of a deliberately constructed surface, is a piece of engineering. A route, in the sense of a path that reliably gets you from one place to another, is something much older and often not human in origin. Humans did not begin by deciding to build roads. They began by walking where walking was easiest, then walking where others had already walked, and only much later by improving what centuries of feet had established. Start with the animals, because they were there first. Large mammals moving between water, grazing, and shelter follow consistent routes, and they are good at it. A herd finds the gentlest gradient up a ridge, the shallowest ford across a river, the gap through a range of hills. They repeat those routes across generations, and the repetition compacts the soil, kills vegetation, and produces a visible trail. Early humans followed those trails for the same reason the animals made them, because they represented the path of least resistance through difficult terrain, worked out by an enormous amount of trial and error. In a number of documented cases, roads that exist today follow alignments that began as game trails, were adopted as footpaths, widened into cart tracks, paved as highways, and eventually surfaced for motor traffic. The route survived every change in technology because the underlying terrain never changed. Let's talk about the wooden trackways too, because this represents the first phase where humans clearly built rather than followed. The problem being solved was wetland. Marsh, bog, and fen are close to impassable on foot. They are dangerous, and they frequently sit between places people need to connect. Across northern Europe, communities responded by laying timber structures across them. The Sweet Track in Somerset in southwest England is the best-known example, dated by tree rings to the very start of the 4th millennium BCE. Its construction was more sophisticated than the term walkway suggests. Poles of ash, oak, and lime were driven into the peat in crossed pairs, and oak planks were laid into the resulting V-shaped supports, producing a raised single-file walkway. Comparable trackways have been found across Ireland, the Netherlands, and northern Germany, some considerably later, and some substantially wider, built well enough to take vehicles. What makes them so valuable to archaeology is the same thing that made them necessary. Waterlogged peat excludes oxygen, so the wood never rotted. The wheel changes the requirements entirely, and it is worth being clear about the sequence. Evidence for wheeled vehicles appears from around the 4th millennium BCE across parts of Europe and the Near East, and once goods are moving on wheels rather than on backs or sledges, the demands on a surface become severe. A person on foot can cope with mud, loose stone, and uneven ground. A loaded cart cannot. Wheels sink, axles break, and a rut that fills with water becomes a trap. So the wheel and the built road develop together, each one making the other worth having, and a great deal of early road engineering is essentially an attempt to give wheels something firm and level to run on. Let's talk about crossings too, because this represents the part of road building that determines where roads go at all. A road is only as useful as its worst obstacle, and the worst obstacle is almost always water. Rivers dictate routes far more than hills do because a gradient can be climbed slowly, while a river cannot be crossed at all without a ford, a ferry, or a bridge. Fords are the oldest answer, and the reason an enormous number of settlements exist. Where they do, a shallow, firm-bottomed crossing point attracts traffic, traffic attracts trade, trade attracts a town. A very large number of place names across Europe preserve exactly this, containing elements meaning ford or crossing. And the towns that grew at those points frequently became the important ones in their regions purely because everybody had to pass through. Bridges changed the calculation, and were expensive enough that building one was a major undertaking. Early bridges were timber, felled trunks or trestles, and they washed away regularly in floods. Stone arch construction, developed and used extensively by Roman engineers, produced structures that could stand for centuries and a number of Roman bridges still carry traffic. The arch works by turning the load into compression, which is what stone handles best, and it allowed spans that a stone beam could never achieve. Building one required scaffolding to hold the arch shape until the final stone was placed, and that temporary framework was frequently the hardest part of the job. Elsewhere, entirely different solutions worked well. The Inca suspension bridges of woven grass spanned gorges no arch could have crossed, and they were rebuilt on a regular schedule as a community obligation rather than being expected to last. Let's talk about the first paved roads too, because this represents where construction becomes deliberate infrastructure. Stone-paved streets appear in Mesopotamian cities from the 3rd millennium BCE, and the cities of the Indus Valley, notably Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, show planned street grids with surfaced roads and, remarkably, covered drainage running alongside them. Egypt has a strong claim to one of the oldest paved roads outside a city, a route running to a basalt quarry built of slabs to move enormous stone loads. What these examples share is purpose. Early paved roads were built where the load justified the expense, inside dense cities and along routes carrying heavy industrial material. Nobody was paving the countryside. This detail is worth sitting with directly because road building is expensive in a way that is easy to underestimate. A road is not a one-off construction. It is a permanent liability. Surfaces break up under traffic, frost, and water. Drainage silts up. Bridges rot and wash out. Embankments slump. A road network requires a continuous flow of labor and money forever, which means road networks are built only by states that are organized enough to sustain that flow and have a strong enough reason to bother. Historically, the reason has almost always been the same two things: moving armies and collecting taxes. Trade benefits enormously, and trade is frequently a side effect rather than the motivation. Let's talk about how roads got paid for too, because this represents the problem that kept defeating everyone and shaped what actually got built. Roads are what economists would later call a difficult good to charge for. Everyone benefits. The benefit is spread thinly across a huge number of people, and nobody has much incentive to fund maintenance individually. Local labor obligations produced poor work because the people doing it had no stake in the outcome and no expertise. Central funding required a state both rich enough and stable enough to sustain it indefinitely, which is exactly why the great networks correlate so tightly with strong empires. The solution that broke the deadlock in Britain was the Turnpike Trust. From the late 17th century onward, groups of local investors were authorized by statute to take responsibility for a stretch of road, improve it, and charge tolls to recover the cost. Gates were placed across the road, and the name comes from the spiked barrier used to block passage until payment was made. The system spread rapidly, and by the early 19th century covered a large share of the main routes in Britain. It worked in the sense that road quality and journey times improved dramatically over the period, and it was widely resented, with toll gates attacked and destroyed in a number of organized protests. Similar toll-funded arrangements appeared elsewhere, and the underlying logic has never gone away. Toll roads, road pricing, and fuel duties are all attempts to answer the same question about who pays for a surface that everyone uses and nobody owns. Let's talk about Rome too, because this represents the most famous road network in history, and the reputation is deserved for reasons often misunderstood. Roman roads were built primarily for the military. The purpose was to move legions and supplies quickly and predictably across an enormous territory, which is why they were built straight wherever the terrain permitted. A straight line is the shortest route, and Roman engineering was willing to cut, embank, bridge, and tunnel rather than detour. Construction was layered. A trench was dug, and into it went a foundation of large stones. Then a layer of smaller stone or rubble, then a layer of finer material often bound with mortar or gravel, and finally a wearing surface, which on major roads was fitted stone slabs. The whole structure was cambered, so water ran off to drainage ditches on either side, and the drainage matters at least as much as the paving, since water sitting in a road destroys it. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Total depth on a major road could reach a meter or more. The scale is difficult to overstate. The network eventually ran to tens of thousands of miles of major roads, with far more secondary routes tied together by milestones and by an official relay system that allowed messages and officials to travel at speeds not matched in Europe again for well over 1,000 years. Some Roman roads carry traffic today, and a substantial number of modern European routes follow Roman alignments closely, because the engineers picked the best line the first time. Let's talk about what happened afterwards too, because this represents one of the clearest examples of infrastructure decaying faster than it was built. Roman roads survived the empire that made them, but they were not maintained. Without a central authority funding repair, surfaces broke up, bridges collapsed and were not replaced, and stone was quarried out of roadbeds for building material. Travel across much of Europe became slower and more dangerous for centuries. Responsibility for roads devolved to local parishes and manors, which lacked both the money and the engineering knowledge, and the standard obligation that local people should give a few days of unpaid labor to road repair each year, produced predictably poor results. Descriptions of English roads through the 17th century include carts sunk to the axle and travelers drowning in flooded ruts, which is not hyperbole. Elsewhere, road building continued at a scale Europe was not matching. The Persian Royal Road, established under the Achaemenid Empire, ran a very long distance with staging posts allowing rapid relay of royal messages. Chinese dynasties built and maintained extensive networks, with the Qin standardizing axle widths, which forced ruts to a common gauge so carts could run consistently across the empire. The Inca built an enormous system through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, running through mountains at high altitude, incorporating stairways, causeways, and suspension bridges woven from grass and rebuilt annually by local communities under a labor obligation. Remarkably, the Inca network was built and used without wheeled vehicles and without horses, designed for people on foot and for llamas, which changes the engineering priorities completely. Steep stairways are fine for a train of llamas and impossible for a cart. Let's talk about the competition too, because this represents something that shaped road history more than any engineering decision. For most of recorded history, moving goods over land was appallingly expensive compared with moving them by water. The figures vary by period and place, but the general pattern is consistent. Hauling a cargo a given distance overland could cost many times what the same journey cost by river or coast, because a single boat carries what would need a long train of carts, animals, and drivers, all of whom need feeding. The consequence is that serious bulk trade followed water wherever water existed. Cities grew on rivers and harbors, and inland regions without navigable water stayed comparatively poor and isolated. Roads carried people, messages, soldiers, and high-value goods, and left grain, stone, timber, and coal to the boats. Canal building in the 18th century pushed this further, and then railways arrived and took over long-distance freight almost entirely. Through much of the 19th century, road building in industrializing countries actually slowed, since the main routes were now steel rails, and roads were relegated to feeding traffic to and from stations. That reversal is worth noting because it undercuts any sense that road development was a steady march. It stalled for decades, and what revived it was the internal combustion engine, which put a vehicle capable of point-to-point travel into private hands and made a sealed surface reaching every destination worth building again. Let's talk about the modern road too, because this represents a real engineering breakthrough after a very long gap. Through the late 18th and early 19th centuries, several engineers in Britain and France reworked road construction from first principles. Pierre-Marie Jérôme Trezeguet in France reduced the massive Roman-style foundation to something thinner and cheaper while keeping the essential drainage. Thomas Telford built roads with a carefully constructed stone foundation and a strong emphasis on gradient and drainage. And John Loudon McAdam, working in Scotland and England, made the argument that transformed the field. The foundation was largely unnecessary if the subsoil was kept dry, and what mattered was a compacted layer of small, angular broken stone raised above the surrounding ground and cambered to shed water. Under traffic, the angular stones locked together into a solid mass. The method was cheap, used readily available material, and worked, and it spread rapidly. His name survives in the word macadam and later in tar macadam. Once tar was added to bind the surface and suppress dust. A modification driven substantially by the arrival of motor vehicles, whose tires tore up loose stone surfaces and threw up choking clouds of dust. The car rewrote everything again. Rubber tires at speed demand a smooth, sealed, continuous surface, and asphalt and concrete became the standard. Volumes of traffic that no earlier era approached required entirely new thinking about capacity, junctions, and safety. Purpose-built, high-speed roads with separated carriageways and no crossings at grade appeared in the early 20th century. And after the Second World War, many countries committed to enormous national networks. In the United States, the interstate system was justified partly on defense grounds, echoing the Roman logic almost exactly, and its construction reshaped where people lived, how cities were laid out, and which places prospered or declined. That reshaping was not evenly distributed, and in many American cities, the routes chosen ran directly through established neighborhoods, displacing large numbers of residents and dividing communities in ways that are still argued about and still visible on the ground. Let's talk about what a road is actually made of today, too, because this represents an area where the visible surface is the least important part. A modern highway is a layered structure, and almost all of it is buried. Below the visible wearing course sits a binder layer. Below that a base. Below that a sub-base of compacted granular material. And below all of it, the prepared subgrade of the natural ground itself. The job of that stack is to spread the concentrated load of a wheel out across a wide enough area that the soil underneath can carry it without deforming. And the reason heavy vehicles matter so disproportionately in road damage is that this stress does not scale gently with weight. A loaded truck does not do slightly more damage than a car. The relationship is steep enough that ordinary car traffic contributes very little to the wear on a road built for freight. Drainage remains the central concern, exactly as it was for Roman engineers and for macadam. Water beneath a road softens the subgrade and destroys the load-spreading structure from below, and water within the surface layers expands when it freezes, cracking the material apart. Most road failure is a water story. The other dominant factor is the material itself. Asphalt is a flexible surface that deforms slightly under load and can be resurfaced in a single layer, while concrete is rigid, lasts longer, and is far more disruptive and costly to repair. Choosing between them is a long-term financial decision as much as an engineering one, and different countries have made it differently. Let's talk about the rules too, because this represents an invention as necessary as the surface itself. A road with enough traffic on it stops working without agreement about behavior, and those agreements are surprisingly recent. Which side to drive on was settled locally and inconsistently for centuries, with various explanations offered for the split. Mounted riders keeping their sword arm toward oncoming strangers is the usual account for the left, and teamsters riding the near horse of a large team is the usual account for the right. Neither of which is as well documented as its confident retelling suggests. What is clear is that consistency only became urgent once vehicles were fast enough that a head-on meeting was fatal. Traffic control followed the same pattern. Signaling devices for street traffic appeared in the late 19th century, electric signals in the early 20th, and painted lane markings, standardized signage, and speed limits all arrived within a few decades of mass motoring. Driving tests, licensing, and enforcement came later still in most countries. The pattern throughout is reactive. Each measure arrived after the harm it was meant to prevent had already become common enough to be intolerable, which is a fair description of how most infrastructure regulation has developed. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together. Roads were not invented at a single moment. The oldest routes were made by animals and adopted by people, and some of them are still in use under layers of asphalt. Deliberate construction begins where terrain forces it, which is why the earliest surviving built roads are timber trackways across bogs, dated with striking precision to nearly 6,000 years ago. The wheel raised the stakes since carts demand surfaces feet do not, and paving appears first in cities and on heavy industrial routes where the expense could be justified. Empires built the great networks, almost always for armies and administration first, and those networks decayed quickly when the states funding them failed. The modern road came from a rethinking of the problem around drainage and compacted stone rather than massive foundations. And the motor car then forced sealed surfaces